Hello, students. I want to spend some time today introducing the concept of race and racial inequality. In this introductory lecture, we'll be focusing more on how to distinguish between various concepts. We'll talk a little bit about how sociologists define race and how we actually study it as a concept. And then we'll talk about concepts such as prejudice and stereotyping, bias, microaggression, and then we'll compare that to this larger concept that we call racism. So, in sociology, race is seen in a very specific way. Although race is something that generally we may take for granted as a construct that divides people on the basis of some biological differences, and that in many ways we see race as real, a real characteristic, a real biological characteristic. Sociologists challenge that idea and argue that race is a socially constructed category of people who, although they share some biologically transmitted traits that make those people appear to be similar, that is actually the idea that those traits have been given social significance, which is really what race is about. So, sociologists would say racial distinctions that we see between people, or so called racial distinctions, maybe skin color, eye color, hair texture, eye shape, nose shape, many of these things that we associate with race, sociologists would say are just simple distinctions that appeared among humans as a result of people living in regions of different parts of the world, different regions of the world. There's nothing significant, there's nothing static, there's nothing given about race. That what makes race real is the fact that we have tried to create these categories and call them biologically determined. And then from there, we have assigned worth to those categories. Much research has shown that there's actually more biological diversity within groups than there is between them. So that if you look at the construction of DNA and DNA sequences amongst African Americans, they are actually more, there's actually more variation when you look at those sequences between African Americans than when you look at an African American and a white person. Oftentimes we have a hard time understanding that because we say, but when we look at these people, we see stark differences. So there must be more biological similarities between blacks than there are between a black person and a white person, for example. But biological research has actually shown quite the opposite to be true. So it's very important for sociologists to start with the understanding that race is not a given. Race is not a predetermined biological distinction that exists between people. That people have definitely um, developed racial distinctions or things that we can call racial distinctions that have a lot to do with just where our ancestors um, lived, but that there's nothing real, there's nothing socially significant about these distinctions. The distinctions that we make, the stereotypes that we generate, the opportunities that we give to some groups over others, and that we say it's on the basis of race, that is what sociologists would say is a sociological construction. And so, therefore, we have to talk about the social significance of race for sociologists, because you might be tempted to say, well, then sociologists don't think that race is really real. So then that means that we don't study race. We absolutely study race. Although we don't see it as a real biological construct, we do see it as being a very socially significant construct. It's a category that has been given such significant social meaning in our society that it has completely shaped the experiences that we have in all aspects of our life. Inequality in educational achievements, income and wealth, life expectancy, occupational prestige, type of job you can expect to have. All of these things are impacted by our perceived race. We have constructed a society that has made race important. And that's why we study it as sociologists, not because we think it's biologically significant, but because we think we have made it something that is significant. We've given it social significance. And therefore, we definitely focus on race and talk about it quite a bit in sociology. But I also wanted to distinguish between some different ways that sociologists go about studying race. Um, I would like to start by just talking about the concepts of prejudice and stereotype, aggression, microaggression, and then we'll talk a little bit more about the concept of racism and how it differs from things such as prejudice and stereotyping. Now, generally, we define a prejudice as defined um, is a set of attitudes that people have about a group. They're generally based on very rigid generalizations about an entire category of people that a person might hold. And they're based on preconceived notions, not based on any reason or any real experience with a group of people. That's why we call it a prejudice, because you're judging someone prior to having any real experience with that individual or even that group. We all have prejudices, and we oftentimes use prejudices to help us understand or at least feel like we understand something about a group. It allows us to feel as if we can relate to a group of people if we use a prejudice to help us think that we understand that group. Now, prejudice can be negative or positive. It doesn't always mean that prejudice means that we think negatively about a group. It could be a positive prejudice by looking at a group and saying, oh, these individuals are known to be very smart, very talented, very intellectual, very athletic, or whatever it might be. But then we also know that there are negative prejudices where we look at a group of people and assume this group of people is poor, this group of people is not intelligent. And we've been kind of battling this notion of these prejudices coming to life in a very visible way in our society, definitely over the last 6 months as these conversations have been definitely coming to light. Now, when we talk about stereotypes, that also builds on this notion of prejudice, if you will. Um, a prejudice is prejudging a group and believing that you know something about that group. But oftentimes, our prejudices are products of the stereotypes that we have about groups or that our society has and that we've latched onto. A stereotype is an exaggerated description applied to every person in a category. So they're widely held. A lot of people know stereotypes of many different ethnic and racial groups. We've heard them, we know them, we might not believe them, we might not sanction them, but most of you could probably list some stereotypes that are associated with different racial and ethnic groups. These stereotypes are very fixed, they're hard to change, and they're oversimplified images, meaning that they are not in any way characteristic of who people really are. They are like bits and pieces of kind of characterized, traits of people. These like it's almost like drawing a caricature and thinking that that is now the defining attribute of an individual. It's just the things that have become most salient, and that is what we use as a basis of thinking about how to judge other groups. We oftentimes talk about something called a stereotype threat, which really deals with the idea that there is a lot of risk to people who are stereotyped because their understanding and knowledge of these stereotypes may eventually lead them to accept the stereotype. We call that a self fulfilling prophecy. The idea that the stereotype itself can become so um, heavy on someone. They've heard it so many times that after a while they start to say, well, if this is what people think I am, then maybe this is what I am. Maybe this is how I should behave. So we talk about the idea of a stereotype threat in the sense that we know stereotyping people over and over again can lead people to actually um, kind of become or live out the stereotype. That's the self-fulfilling prophecy. There's been some really interesting research about kids and IQ testing. One study found that when African American kids and white kids were given an IQ test, they were given it twice. The first time they gave them the test, they told them that the test was just for fun, that they just wanted to see how much the kids had learned in school, and basically to do the best you can. The second time they gave the test, they actually told the African American students as well as the white students that typically African American students don't do as well on these tests, that they have lower math scores, and that generally white students do better. What the research found was that on the first test, when kids were not told that there were any racial disparities in performance, the students did equally well. But on the second test, where students were told that Black students don't perform as well and that white students tend to do better, there was a marked disparity in their performance on those tests, where the African American students did much worse than the white students. And that's kind of how stereotype threat works. That if people kind of go in with this belief that we're not as smart, we're not as talented, we can't do as well, then that actually plays out in their realities. Another thing you may have heard about recently are these concepts of implicit bias and what we call racial microaggressions. I always think of them as probably the biggest ways that we show our misunderstandings of difference, racial and ethnic difference. The idea of a microaggression or a racial microaggression really is simply the casual way that we degrade marginalized groups. And we don't do it to be mean, usually, but it's done. It's, for example, in this illustration that you see, it's seeing um, a Middle Eastern or a Muslim individual, for example, and when they tell you that they were born in Canada, that you're surprised, you're shocked because you're assuming by the way they look or even by the way they dress that they must have been born someplace else. They couldn't have possibly been born in Canada. You weren't born in the Middle East, for example, or making the assumption that all people from Mexico know how to speak Spanish or all Mexican immigrants know how to speak Spanish. Um, Even this other portrait here of the person with a disability and someone making a statement that, you seem fine to me, you seem normal to me, which implies that people with disabilities are not normal. These racial aggressions get played out all the time. And I actually have a couple of videos and an article um, that I would like for you to watch. They are also posted in Canvas. The other two terms I'd like to define are explicit and implicit bias, mainly implicit bias. I'd like to start there because implicit bias involves the subconscious feelings, perceptions, attitudes, and stereotypes that become automatic responses that we have when we look at people. The idea behind implicit bias, however, is that you aren't even aware that you're doing it. Psychologists have been all over this concept. It's, for example, the idea of being able to look at someone and automatically maybe feeling fear if you believe that this is a group of people that might bring harm to you. Crossing the street if you see someone because you think it might be unsafe. You may not even be consciously aware of the action, but the bias that you feel, those subconscious feelings that have been ingrained in us, lead us to act and treat people in ways that we aren't even really cognizant of. Um, there's also another video that's been posted that talks a little bit about explicit bias and implicit bias. And I would like for you to take a look at those as well.